Thank you so much, Melissa. Thanks, everyone. We're going to move on to our last topic for the day, actually. Our next presenters will share wise practices from a union perspective and from an employer perspective. First, I'd like to call upon Larry Rousseau, who is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. Larry has a long history of trade union and political activism, particularly on issues like labor relations, health and safety, human rights, and equity. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you, everyone, all the organizers of this summit, this inaugural summit, National Virtual Summit on Employment and Episodic Disabilities. I'm coming to you from the traditional unceded Anishinaabe territory, where the Anishinaabe people have been stewards of this land for millennia. And as a settler, I strive to achieve my responsibilities for reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people. As a representative of the Congress, I'll be focusing my remarks on union-led initiatives and advocacy points on employment and episodic disabilities, in particular those that are advocated by and for workers with disabilities through our network of 55 affiliates, 3 million workers across Canada. So historically and until the present day, unions have played and continue to play an important role in advancing disability rights in the world of work by working to eliminate physical barriers that limit workplace accessibility, negotiating health benefits and leaves that are often crucial to workers with disabilities. And we push hard, very hard, to extend these benefits to all workers by lobbying, across the board for programs such as universal pharmacare, leaves for non-unionized folks, as well as unionized folks, and other supports. Negotiation, collective bargaining through arbitration if necessary, the accommodation, or as Dr. Roberts would like to call it, inclusivity of needs of individual workers. And for the purpose, I do like Dr. Roberts' intervention about language and how language evolves. I do like the term inclusiveness. We're hearing a lot about diversity and inclusion. And when we look at accommodation, I agree that it seems to be a step, but for the purpose of my presentation, of course, in labor, duty to accommodate represents a legal dynamic. It's an entire legal field with jurisprudence that all union and HR folks understand. So I'll be using it, but I do like, and sometimes maybe I'll go back and forth between accommodation and inclusivity. So we lobby, the CLC and Canada's unions lobby for improvements to legislation that include workers' compensation legislation, short and long-term disability plans, and accessibility improvements, improving accessibility in our workplaces as well as in our union spaces. So thanks to the efforts of disability rights activists in the trade union movements, sectors with higher unionization rates do tend to have better rates of hiring as well as retaining workers with disabilities. Workers with disabilities have been more successfully employed in the federal public sector with a unionization rate of over 76% compared to the unionization rate in the privately federally regulated sector that has a unionization rate of about 34%. But many challenges remain to ensure that workers with disabilities are included, welcomed in our workplaces and in the labor movement, so that our movement can benefit from the strengths and abilities of all of its members. The labor movement has always championed the principle that workers should have a say over their work schedules. Flex time is so important. Workers have a right to negotiate through collective agreements, the duration and scheduling of hours of works. And for many unions, full-time, full-year, 9-to-5 employment with a single employer represented the standard for gainful employment. But Today, we're seeing many temporary, casual, and part-time workers who are continuing to prefer full-time work. And so therefore, with many other workers, when we look at women, students, workers with disabilities who cannot work full-time schedules because of unequal and unpaid caregiving burdens, for example, they may prefer part-time or temporary employment to full-time work, regardless of whether or not workers choose to work full-time. However, unions will always insist that the work be valued equally. Employers must not be permitted to pay workers less, compensate less, simply because workers are working on a casual or part-time basis instead of full-time. And we've seen that hit really the fan over the past 12 months with the pandemic, with our frontline workers in long-term care institutions. So achieving flexibility on workers' terms with no discrimination based on job permanency or the number of hours worked is therefore vital to achieving equitable inclusion of workers with different needs. Casual and temporary work can be a life changer for workers with episodic disabilities who gain satisfaction, financial stability, and friendship from working, even if they do so sporadically. This was a key component of the work of the Canadian Working Group on HIV and AIDS, which is now called Realize, who urged medical insurance companies to change the rules on how much a person could be allowed to work without losing precious, very important healthcare benefits. Another concrete way unions have been able to defend episodic disability rights at work is by supporting our members at work to understand the duty to accommodate and all of its legal implications, and to empower stewards and union reps to ensure workers' rights are respected in the workplace. So for workers with episodic disabilities, this means knowing that the right to be included, the right to be accommodated, applies to all workers, regardless of unionization, regardless of employee status or seniority, and it is owed to part-time, temporary, and probationary employees in addition to regular full-time workers. In fact, Canadian human rights law recognizes that often the barriers that are faced by certain groups of workers were not limited to this direct discrimination, but rather as a result of workplace requirements, rules, practices, or policies that were neutral on their face, but applied equally to everyone and were never intended to discriminate, but which did have a discriminatory effect on a group or an individual because of a protected human rights characteristic. So by recognizing this systemic type of discrimination, Canadian law moved from a formal notion of equality, that means that if all people are treated identically, there can be no discrimination, which we knew in practice was completely false, to a substantive notion of equality, that in order to treat people equally, we may have to treat people differently from each other. And here's an important point. Human rights legislation has a special, almost constitutional legal status, meaning that if there is a conflict between human rights law and a discriminatory collective agreement clause, policy, or a practice or a rule, human rights law will override the other. Human rights legislation will also override non-human rights legislation. And this means the essence of the duty to accommodate is this recognition to include people completely and fully and equally in the workplace. It's equally important to remember that in common sense terms, duty to accommodate can be seen as a legal duty on an employer to take steps to offset the discriminatory impact of a workplace treatment, requirement, rule, practice, by making sure that the worker is included to the point of undue hardship on the employer. The obligation or responsibility to accommodate is primarily on the employer, and all workers, including workers with episodic disabilities, have certain legal rights and duties connected to the process of inclusivity. Employers also need to be aware that even if a worker was successfully included or accommodated at one point in their career, the duty to accommodate is ongoing. So an employer may have to accommodate an individual a few different times over the course of their career, perhaps on the basis of different prohibited grounds of discrimination. And finally, we need employers to be more engaged in educating themselves and their workplaces on issues that impact disability, even beyond the duty to accommodate. This means moving beyond the bare minimum for workers with disabilities and better understanding that the needs of workers with disabilities, which can often be seen as not real or invisible. This is particularly important to emphasize as we hear reports from more and more workers experiencing the long haul impact of COVID-19. Who are identifying as workers with episodic disabilities. So this is now opening a whole new chapter on episodic disabilities. On this issue, we know that the COVID pandemic has disproportionately affected Canadians with disabilities and highlighted longstanding challenges, that this current health crisis has also intensified the discrimination and stigma that workers with disabilities were already facing. Hard-won workplace accommodations like those I shared earlier are at risk. When the office becomes virtual, as we were just hearing, with disabilities and workers with disabilities are at a greater risk of being laid off or having their jobs furloughed. I'm going to finish with this, and it is critical that we shine a light on the challenges that are faced with persons with episodic disabilities during this pandemic, especially those whose experiences are amplified by multiple marginalized identities and intersectionalities, including being a woman, being Indigenous, being racialized, and being LGBTQI. Our latest national campaign at the Canadian Labour Congress is called Forward Together. It outlines an economic recovery plan that centers workers and their families, and we need to disaster-proof our country so that no one is left behind when hit with a crisis, and this includes workers with episodic disabilities. It requires collective action. We need to collaborate with employer groups and the governments to ensure that we come out stronger on the other side of this pandemic. Please go to Canadian Plan, all one word, canadianplan.ca to learn more. And I thank you very much again for having me with you today.
Thank you so much, Larry. I really appreciate that passionate presentation. That was great. The labor movement, of course, has an important role to play in developing best practices in accommodation and support for people living and working with episodic disabilities. Now, I'd like to welcome our final presenter for the day, Wendy Porch. Wendy is no stranger to many of the participants, having led our work on episodic disabilities for many, many years. Wendy Porch is the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Living Toronto and brings a unique perspective as both an employer and an advocate and researcher into disability issues. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. It's a bit like a family reunion for me, in fact, seeing all of these names and all of these presenters. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I have some slides that I'd like to share, and I just wonder if I'm going to be able to share my screen here. Okay, hang on. Let's see. Can everybody see those? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to move it into presentation mode. And hopefully that will work too. Hang on. Where is the view for presentation mode? Okay, sorry everybody, hang on. Bear with me here. Here we go. Okay, so accommodations from an employer perspective. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do at the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto. I do want to just say I am a white, cisgendered, disabled woman, and I'm speaking from my perspective. I am a person with a disability who has I've tried to do quite a lot of work around making the narrative of disability and the kinds of things that we as disabled people experience in terms of exclusion making that a little bit more visible and coming to the forefront so that we can talk about how are we included? How do we have those conversations about being included? So, and I'm going to speak to it from the perspective of an employer as the executive director at the Center for Independent Living. And I should say that Silt, we're also known as Silt. Silt is not necessarily a traditional workplace. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why, but I think that there's still some things here that are quite interesting that can be applied more broadly. So. Okay, so what is Silt? We are for persons with a disability by persons with a disability. We are consumer controlled. We're a community resource organization. We help people with disabilities to learn skills to be able to live independently in the community. Our founding philosophy is the independent living philosophy that says that people with disabilities, we ourselves are the experts in what we need to be able to live independently in the community. Our work is centered around models that empower people and provide people with the dignity, the inherent dignity that we all have, versus a kind of more medical model that can sometimes be disempowering for people. We think it's very important for people with disabilities to be able to make choices, to examine options, to make mistakes. That's something as a person with a disability, I can certainly say. There's a tendency to kind of keep people with disabilities away from options that other people might be able to engage with and not even think twice about. So we believe in people having autonomy and the capacity to be able to examine choices and take risks. And that's basically what I'm saying here. We are a resource center. We provide programs in the Toronto area, but we also provide programs across Ontario. One thing that's unique about us too is that the majority of our board and staff must be people with disabilities. So that's written into our bylaws. That's different from a lot of organizations, I think, that are related to supporting people with disabilities. So our chair and our vice chair have to be people with disabilities. And I'm the executive director. I'm a person with a disability. All of the people who have sat in my chair before me are also people with disabilities. And here you can see our consumer involvement is in our bylaws. It's important that this is actually represented in the structure of what we do. And I've told you a little bit about this. I'm not going to talk through it because I don't know if I have a lot of time, but we do provide a number of programs. So we have core programs. Those are largely peer-based programs that see people with disabilities supporting other people with disabilities in the community in terms of negotiating services, in terms of issues that they might run into with service providers, in terms of broader questions around inclusion. We've been doing a lot around the COVID vaccine rollout, and we've been doing quite a lot around IPAC in the community as well through our core programs. We have a direct funding program. This is a totally different model of service provision where people with disabilities themselves hire their own attendants directly, where they would normally get those services through the LHIN. So that's, again, a very different model of service provision that puts a person with a disability at the center. We support other programs around people accessing supportive housing and attendant service in the community. We've supported independent living for more than 35 years. And just to say again, we see people with disabilities as an expert. So this means that in the context of accommodations at Silt, if we don't accommodate people with disabilities at Silt, we cannot fulfill our mandate. So it is a very central part of what we do. And the accommodations that we provide for people are not just for staff, they're for students that come to work with us, they're for volunteers, they're for board members, they're for anybody who's engaging with us in a participatory capacity. We encourage people to self-identify when accommodations are needed, but we do know that we need to ask. So there is an employer obligation to inquire. So if there's clearly something happening where it looks like it might be a performance issue and we're not sure, as an employer, we are obliged to inquire about whether or not there's a need for an accommodation. We don't require diagnosis or personal information to be able to provide accommodations. We just need to be able to know that there's a conversation that should be had around accommodations. Generally at Silt, these are negotiated informally with managers with some exceptions, but generally it's just a conversation that we have with folks. We have a culture of accommodating people. So in our office in pre-COVID days, if you walked into Silt, you would see that because we are quite unusual in that when we're actually in the office, we have on-site attendance. So we have, as members of staff of our organization, attendants, and attendants are people who provide help to people with disabilities with using the bathroom or eating or getting dressed or, kind of working. We have them as staff members at Silt, and they are right at the front door when you come in. So you can see quite clearly when you come to Silt that this is a place where accommodations are just part of our values. Staff and management as people with disabilities. So our leadership are often people with disabilities, as are our staff. We talk about accommodations very openly. People are often very knowledgeable about what they need, and it's just an opportunity to kind of have a conversation about it and, formalize that and provide that to folks. We've also, because of the work that I used to do with Realize, so I sat in Melissa's seat for many years at Realize, all of the staff at Silt have undertaken training on episodic disability and work. And so everybody has a sense of understanding what kinds of accommodations might be helpful in the context of living with an episodic disability. And also they know that we are open to having those discussions about implementing those accommodations. And there's a range of policies related to accommodation at Silt too. The types of accommodations that we have found useful and that we have employed across the years, as I said, we have staff attendants on site. So for anybody that comes into our space with a physical disability or otherwise who needs the assistance of an attendant, they are there. In pre-COVID days. Things have been different lately, but hopefully when we get back to the office, we'll be back in the same position. We found, for some folks, depending on what their disability is, that just even having a place to rest is very helpful and very important and can actually make the difference for folks around whether they're able to work or not. So we've had a range of solutions to this. We've had couches in people's offices. We've had yoga mats that people can kind of pull out if they want to have a rest in their office, in the boardroom, near their desk. We've employed and used all kinds of different pieces of technology. So drag and dictate, Zoom text, alt formats, providing things to people in Braille. We've done all of those things. In particular around supporting people with episodic disabilities. So the places to rest is an important one. Flexible work hours. So we're very flexible in terms of the work hours. So if somebody says to us, I'm not great in the morning, I'm better in the afternoon, would it be okay if I worked from here to here and I can kind of make the time up a little bit later? That's a conversation with somebody's manager. Again, we don't ask why. There's no requirement in terms of the diagnosis, but those are conversations that have been had, and those are things that have been helpful for people. And flexible breaks too, so fatigue, if somebody's dealing with something related to fatigue and they really are having difficulty kind of working through things in the afternoon, or they need to take regular breaks, then that's something that's okay with us too. As an organization, we also allow a relatively high number of sick days to be carried forward as a bridge to LTD if needed. So we recognize that people are going to have times when perhaps they have to take a break from work, and to be able to keep them supported in that period of time, we have an extra high number of sick days that can be carried over. And of course, we have LTD for folks too. Just to say, this is important, right? So if you're really going to do accommodations, you have to have a dedicated budget line year over year in your budget for accommodations, and that's what we have. We also have a section of our reserve fund that can be accessed for improvements related to accessibility that might be unfunded elsewhere. So we're putting our money where our mouth is in terms of accommodations to make sure that we have all of those resources available. And also, I think openness to discussion and implementation of accommodations is evident at Silt. As I said, if we didn't do that, we would not be fulfilling our mandate. And it encourages people that are there, that are associated with Silt, to know that we are open to accommodations. And it means that we have a very diverse workforce, and people who are, doing fantastic work and who might not be employed in other traditional kinds of settings. So that's it for me. It's short and sweet, but I wonder if there's any questions. I'm quite happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Wendy. We're going to open it up now to Melissa for any questions for both Larry and you. So Melissa, over to you.
Everyone, it's me again. Okay, thanks so much, Larry and Wendy. That was great. I learned a great deal, and it was really, really nice to hear these two different perspectives because they're incredibly important. I have a couple of questions from the Q&A box. The first one is for Larry. Does the duty to accommodate and accommodating employees override collective agreements, particularly seniority?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I touched on that a little bit at the start of my presentation, but I think perhaps giving an example or speaking how this can actually happen in day to day. We heard Wendy talking about scheduling, for example. So collective agreements will talk about, for example, the ability for people to have flexible working arrangements in terms of time, etc. But there will always be a provision that says that subject to management discretion, or subject to operational requirements, or subject to operational constraints, and very often, the HR approach, the management approach to this will be, well, we cannot accommodate this person. A specific example, for example, let's say someone has multiple sclerosis, and that person cannot do a 5-day work week, but can do a 4-day work week and would like to work 2 days, 1 day off, and then 2 days. Fine. And it will come back saying, no, this person absolutely has to be present 5 days a week because it's a call center. This happens all the time. And what happens is that very often by putting that in place and saying, no, we cannot accommodate, very often it just stays there, and people do not get accommodated properly, included properly in their workplace. And what happens is that it won't go up to the labor board. People give up, don't want to rock the boat, etc., and then do not get the employer to do this. But I can tell you that if it does go up to the labor board, the management, the employer has to prove that there will be undue hardship, and that case can be won. But unfortunately, too many of those cases do not get to where they need to be. But I can tell you that the law and the human rights considerations, and if the case can be made that there is a case to be made under duty accommodate as well as human rights, then that person will win. But you can have the greatest case in the world. What happens in reality is that people are frustrated, obfuscated, etc., and they simply give up. But long answer to the short, to basically saying that the collective agreement cannot trump, no pun intended, human rights law.
Thank you, Larry. Really appreciate that. I'm just going to ask one question from the chat box to Wendy, which is from Margaret Oldfield, who also says, hello, it's nice to see you. And she's wondering, how does the open culture of accommodation at Silt influence the accommodation of employees for other reasons, like child or elder care and other family obligations?
I think that it just sets the tone for all of those things. I think that we're very flexible. I think because we're flexible from the start in terms of making sure that we do have this culture of accommodation, that it just sort of settles across all of those areas. So all of these things we're open to having conversations about them and figuring out what works for people. And it's interesting, right? Particularly in a COVID context. And I think as a disabled person myself, and connected very much to the community, we've seen such dramatic shifts around, for example, remote conferencing, remote work. We all know that is more than possible. It's actually been very good for some people, right? Aside from the pandemic element of this, I think for many people who might have difficulty in terms of transportation or issues like that, remote work has opened up, you know, and so I think really sometimes it's a matter of will, you know, if you are open and you have the will to move into this kind of a position where this is just a culture, you know, we're going to be flexible by virtue of making sure that everybody has a possibility to participate, then, you know, it's possible to do that, I think. So that's how we've been trying to work for some time. And I can't take credit for most of that. This is the way that Silt has always operated, is that, you know, because people with disabilities are at the center of what we do have this culture. But, you know, if everybody did this, think of the impact that people with disabilities could make more broadly, right? How much more engaged everybody could be. And I do hope that after the pandemic, if there is an end to this, frankly, that we hold on to this flexibility around remote work. I think it's going to be a really critical piece and could really move people forward in quite a dramatic way.
Mm-hmm. I agree, absolutely. And that calls us back to the comment that Vera made about, you know, inclusion versus accessibility. And I think that's really important. We have got to wrap things up for the day just to honor everybody's time and make sure that we get things done as we said we would. So I'm going to hand things over to David again, but thank you, Larry and Wendy. It was wonderful. It was really nice to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And thank you again, Larry and Wendy. Great presentations there. So we've reached the end of our agenda for this afternoon. I want to thank all of our presenters again. You've certainly given us a lot to think about as we move forward into Friday's session. I also want to give particular thanks to Employment and Social Development Canada and the National Research Council Canada. Without their support, the summit would not have been possible. Friday will begin another level of complexity, I know. We have enough complexity in our lives already, but in the current situation, how can we gather together to discuss episodic disabilities in employment and not address COVID-19? We have three excellent presenters who will help us navigate the impact of COVID-19 and the impact it's had on employment in Canada. We also will have a lived experience keynote address from Dr. Margot Feldman. Margot is a writer, educator, and community builder who believes that we can heal ourselves and our world through the soft magic of collaboration, accountability, mutual care, curiosity, compassion, and community. They are currently at work on a memoir entitled The Bed of Sickness, Essays on Care. After the break on Friday is when we particularly want to hear from you. We have planned a facilitated large group discussion to help determine the direction of a national action plan on episodic disabilities. We will begin promptly at 1 p.m. on Friday. Thanks again for taking part today, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the day.